Now, what the AFL administrators didn't want, I suppose, is to go back in time and have this sort of play. So, in part, this is a reason for wanting to modify the game as players got bigger and stronger and more professional, so that we could avoid some of this. And I'm not sure this will work, but hopefully it will. So for the people experienced in AFL, they'd see that much of that in the 80s and early 90s was deliberate, and there were some accidental collisions, but most of it was deliberate. So rule changes have been introduced to stop much of that head-high tackling and collisions, and we have also over time looked at videos for collisions, and this is what we found. These are all grand finals, so where the intensity tends to be higher and you typically have more collisions. So what we saw is probably a trending upwards over time, and then we've only really measured one grand final over the last 10 years or so, and it looked like perhaps it's gone down. It might have just been that particular grand final, but we've done a lot more in our home and away games, a lot of collision analysis in home and away games over the last decade. And on it, some of these dots have multiple points underneath. This just shows the number of collisions in a quarter. So there are a lot more data points than is shown here. But you can see that, and it's a significant decrease over time. So collisions and a lot of what I showed you in that video was deliberate, and we've got rid of many of those. So collisions overall have gone down, and that's been a good thing for the game. But it's still, obviously, there are collisions, and some of them now can be measured in terms of G-forces because we have players wearing GPS units. And one of them, which is accidental, we'll probably never get rid of the accidental ones, a player actually had a GPS unit on. And again, if I can manage to get my... Oh, there you go.
There was a little bit of a word that he was actually injured today, wasn't going to take part. He has hardly put himself in the mix. That's a terrific mark by Greg.
Now that guy who, from the white team from Fremantle is all but 7 feet tall, and the other guy is a big guy himself. So the 7-foot player is about 125 kilos, the other guy is about 6'4" and close to 100 kilos. So a fairly significant collision and accident. But one that's pretty ugly and probably looks even worse from this angle. But we had the GPS unit on.
Right, you're going at half time. Yeah, you're way away from the team.
And recorded the highest we've ever seen, which was 13 G-forces on the thorax. So the head's probably a bit higher than that, probably a lot higher than that actually. So it's things like that probably, and the rising overall injury tally that led to this latest attempt to slow the game down, because those accidents are accidents and will always happen, but there's an increased probability when things are moving fast, when players are moving fast, when the ball's moving fast. So how can we reduce the speed that players move and the ball moves perhaps without changing the nature of the game, because you don't want to change the sport or the spectacle of the sport where possible. Getting back to that chronology, just in terms of interchange, there was a big outcry when particularly in the media, but also among the clubs, and that when the substitute rule was introduced this year. But when you look back through history, we had 2 substitutes, a 19th and then a 20th back in the early part of last century. And then even when I played and Brian played, that you could possibly sit like soccer, sit on the bench all day and never get a game. But then they introduced the interchange in '78 when when I was playing, and then we've gone from 2 interchange to 3 to 4. Some of the other things that I mentioned before, you can also see evolving there, but in particular I wanted to focus on the fact that we've had substitutes before, so we've gone a full circle. But the attempt was to try and prevent so many interchanges from happening. This is a graph, obviously, of the number of interchanges that have been that coaches have been using as a tactical strategy. I've just shown you that in 1978 they could have used interchanges a lot more, but many a time I know I sat on the bench here without getting much of a game, and they didn't use it tactically. I'm not sure the data, we're not sure of the data in there, but it certainly wouldn't have been high. But it was about 10 years ago that who knows what, it was a sort of a chicken and egg thing that coaches decided, look, we're going to get an advantage here if we start to use the interchange bench. There were 4 that we could freely rotate them, and you can see the almost exponential increase in the way in which the interchange bench was used. And without going into too much detail, we can all understand that when players are fresh, then they're able to offer a greater speed, and general movement speeds are increased, and the ball speeds are also increased. So there was some concern here about this just continuing to go up. Well, what can we do to decrease the speed of players when they're on the ground? Perhaps we should look at capping the number of interchange or restricting the number of players involved in the interchange, and that's obviously what's happened with the substitute. One of the physiological consequences of the increasing interchange, if you like, is that players spent less and less time on the ground, and so the distances, I know Brian and his colleagues published a paper back here showing around about 17 kilometres a game, and we published a measure at the same time and found it almost identical with our computer-based tracking. And that decreased, the distances covered per player per game decreased over time as the number of interchange rotations increased, and that made sense because the players were spending less time on the ground. But when they were on the ground, other data showed that they was travelling at very high speeds, and so the average player speeds were going up, as I've shown before. At the same time, the relationship between the number of interchange and the GPS speeds have gone up, and that shows it there. The latest data that we have from this year shows that for one club only, and this is very preliminary, it's only the Crows, about 140 or so data files, but normalised to that last point, as I mentioned the other day, our speeds haven't got any higher and look like they've in fact come down a bit. Also, the distances have gone up slightly because they're spending longer on the ground, and the interchange is essentially the same, whereas we would have predicted perhaps up 130 or so if we followed that line without the change to the rule and the substitute. So it has had an impact, certainly the number of interchanges, distances are slightly higher, but the speed is the same or slightly lower. This was of some concern, I think, to everybody involved in the AFL, and that is the relationship, significant relationship in the injury prevalence versus the number of interchange going over the last decade. So as interchange numbers increased, the injury prevalence was related to that. So it's using the same data I've presented in other graphs, but and here the injury incidence. So both of them are suggesting there may be a relationship between using the interchange more, increasing player speeds, increasing ball speed and general movement speed, and increasing the probability and of injuries and the actual injury statistics. So the substitute was brought in. That's where this latest data point fits this year, and we'll be looking with great interest to see what happens with injuries. One of the difficulties, even in this early stage, when you have a look at champion data, which is quite a useful database to look at. Sorry, I'll get to the next slide, but this is again a combination of Crows, Adelaide Football Club data, but also champion data, looking at all the clubs. And I've put in green what I think would probably be a useful change that the substitute rule has probably had an effect on. Blue, not sure. For example, if we look at blue, an increase in distance of play, well, is that a good thing, bad thing? I'm not sure. But the average speed decrease at one club, as I said, is probably a good thing because it's decreased. The work units, and it follows on from Tim's presentation, perhaps if the overall work, even though distance has gone up, but the speed has come down, so the sort of weighted work units that we use has gone down, sprint efforts have gone down, it's taking the top end out of the player efforts, body load, acceleration, high intensity running and so forth. So it certainly had an effect in one club, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes across the whole competition. Other things, the number of backward kicks, the number of handballs, the long kicks, the rushed kicks, so to try and clear it has also increased. The secondary stoppages has gone down. So overall, in terms of a spectacle, you'd have to say it is probably more positive than negative. Maybe I'm biased, but that's the way I interpret it. But then there are some potential consequences that haven't been so good. This is the contested play from champion data and the number of tackles from champion data using the whole competition over the whole year over the last decade or so. The number of tackles was going up in a sort of an accelerated way, and probably it's fair to say the contested play looks as if that was accelerating too. In the overall competition this year, that's what's happened. So you can see the tackles has probably deviated from that path that it was on in a significant way. It's only not even mid-year yet, but you'd have to say that that's a fairly significant departure, whereas the contested play looks like it's continuing on that accelerated pathway, and that potentially is a problem. Great as a spectacle, but again, we may not be seeing the anticipated reduction in injuries on the basis that there is as much contested play this year as what we may have predicted last year, and not involving that extra substitute. So it'll be, again, interesting to see how these pan out for the rest of the year. If we look at game structure and the physical demands, one of the things that we measured over time looking at old videos is, and I've mentioned this for soccer, and this is AFL obviously, that we were around about the same as soccer in the early 60s, and then there's not that many games here, but so I've drawn a continuous line, but it really probably should be dots. But just to emphasise what was generally happening, and that was a decrease in the proportion of the game which was play time. Got down to about 50% or so in the late 1990s, and the AFL was concerned for a number of reasons, the injuries being the primary driver, but also the spectacle. They thought when some of the full forwards were taking up to a minute and a half to have a set shot for goal, that it was just not great for the game, and wanted to hurry things on. So there were a few things they changed in terms of rules, but this comes from the AFL. This is back in 2002 when they said, well, this is where we want to go in the next 7 or 8 years. This is their action items. They wanted the primary focus, remember this is 2002, so it's nearly 10 years ago. They said we want to trend back to a more continuous game. They wanted more continuous play. We want to reduce high impact collisions. So they wanted less player density around the ball and less collisions. And the secondary focus was to go back to more traditional highlights of the game, one-on-one contests, contested play, contested marks and positional play.